Good morning. This is Bill Hosley, and in the context of George Floyd and the extraordinary moment of national self-reflection that we're going through about Black lives and our history with slavery and Jim Crow and discrimination, it occurs to me that something I do could be really useful and interesting to people. I'm a museologist, which means I study museums, I work and practice museum work in the ways that curators and museum scholars do, which is, at least in my case, very grounded in the local. My wife is in the same business. Together, we visit a lot of museums. I think we've probably been to 1,000 or more over the years. We're interested in every aspect of American history. I suppose both of us are American studies oriented. And so we've been to a lot of museums, either are all primarily about civil rights and Black history or touch on it in some deep and meaningful way. And this phenomenon didn't exist 30 years ago. And today, in fact, it's been one of the most vibrant sectors of scholarship and activity in museum work over the past 15 years or so. And so we've been to a lot of places, and that's what I want to share, because I think that one of the ways we move forward is by understanding each other better and through communication. And one can read books and watch films and videos, but for me, nothing compares to experiential learning, where you are in a location where something happened or an environment is created or a context is remembered or a story is told that is thick, rich, and impressionable. Once COVID is over, hopefully many of us will be able to travel a little bit more. So this is a presentation, a talk I developed a couple of years ago for our Hartford history series at Capital Community College. And it's called Black History is American History, a Travelogue. And it really takes you on an adventure of some places that are of great interest. Now, just as a little background, African-American history, Black history, begins obviously W.E.B. Du Bois and others there's been a whole literature, and going back even to Frederick Douglass, but the sort of second phase that began after World War II centered around people like John Hope Franklin, who had a PhD from Harvard and taught at Fisk University and wrote this famous book, From Slavery to Freedom. So there's history out there, but not much that you could experience. The national narrative since the 1820s and 30s really is a white elite narrative. We need to grapple with what it is and reflect on it. This shows you how history was viewed. My personal experience, I worked at Wadsworth Atheneum in Hartford, Connecticut for many years and was on the search committee that gave birth to the Amistad Foundation for Arts and Culture, the Amistad Center at the Atheneum in like 1988 or 89. So it's one of the oldest art museum-based programs with a curator and collections and programs in the country. I was honored to be part of beginnings of it. These are some exhibits, fairly recent, so they do a lot of thoughtful stuff. When I was in school, you could have fit all the books on African American art, architecture, and culture. Could have fit them all in a briefcase. I mean, there just wasn't much literature out there. The Amistad Freedom Schooner, which goes from place to place and shares the important message of the Amistad freedom fighters. I formerly was the director of the New Haven Museum, which has the crown jewels of the Amistad story because a lot of it unfolded right in New Haven. Some of the founders of the museum were involved in that, so that's pretty amazing. And I learned a lot about it, but if you go to places like, even big museums like Henry Ford Museum, Colonial Williamsburg, there's more and more inclusion, dramatization, different facets, different faces. My first taste of Deep South public history was a trip to Charleston, I don't know, my first one maybe 15, 16 years ago, and my gosh, what a fascinating place. This is the Aiken Red House, which has and interprets slave quarters and enslaved people's work. Hayward Washington House, also in Charleston, that has slave quarters and history they interpret. This is the Middleton Place Plantation that interprets slavery through slave quarters, and is outside of Charleston, and it's absolutely an amazing destination. One of several exhibit areas, Middleton Place, that interprets slavery. Then there's the old slave mart right in Charleston, an 1850s building that originally functioned as part of the slave trade. Grim, difficult stuff to grapple with, but it's important. And throughout Charleston, there's more and more interpretive signage, which is a wonderful thing, and it brings stories to life in various locations, and it's increasingly Afrocentric in the sense that there are some very interesting stories, like Robert Smalls here, who eventually became a U.S. congressman. Incredible. Anyway, drama. Outside of Charleston, Stratford Hall in the James River Valley region of Virginia, just a spectacular house museum associated with Robert E. Lee, but going back a generation or two before him, and I guess he was born there. And our guide here was just priceless. Nothing you do next year or the year after will be more. You'll really remember it if you get there. It's amazing. And this is Savannah too. Again, back to signage. There's a lot. Savannah does a lot with statuary, and again, this is the important infill work. The traditional history isn't enough. Let's be additive. Let's not necessarily tear down monuments and erase things. So a couple of years ago, my wife and I did this incredible trip, and we've done several of the Deep South, but this is a circuit that I cannot recommend highly enough if you have a week sometime. Fly into Atlanta from anywhere, and it goes through Knoxville and Nashville and the Mississippi Delta and comes back through Birmingham, and these are places are loaded. I mean, you would know more than half the people that teach American history. And almost from the moment you arrive, this is the Hartsfield Airport in Atlanta, and it's, there's a lot of history, but this is part of what you're introduced from the moment you hit the ground. And the first thing we did, we went out to the Atlanta Historical Society is one of the best local history museums, and I admit that, Atlanta, we're talking about a big city, but not every city has this. Boston doesn't. Philadelphia really doesn't tell the story of itself, but Atlanta does, and this place is amazing. More and more, they've got artifacts and art and incorporate the Black experience. What's cool about the Atlanta History Center, it's got a mansion where part of the Hunger Games were filmed. It's amusing. A state-of-the-art history exhibit, and then this Smith Farm. It's kind of a mini, 3 or 4 building on 3 acres. I don't know how big it is, but it's almost like Sturbridge Village, living history, really wonderful stuff. And again, African-American stories are told there. Then there is the Martin Luther King National Historic Site, which I first visited, 25, 30 years ago. And it was just the house, and they were evolving. This thing gets better every couple of years. The National Park Service really nails it. It's so great. And these are just some of the internal exhibits. They probably change things, but it's real state-of-the-art, really worth it. Then in Atlanta, the National Center for Civil and Human Rights Museum, launched by Evelyn Lowry and Andrew Young in 2007, opened in 2014, 30,000 square feet of exhibit space, shares parking garage with Coke World, great location, mobbed. I mean, this place, of course, this is COVID. They're probably closed at the moment, but they'll be open, and it's really, really great. And the High Museum in Atlanta is an art museum that has, again, more and more African American art. But back to the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. This is the building. These are some of the interior exhibits. An exhibit about Emmett Till. Some of it's hard, of course, difficult stuff to observe or experience, but it's state-of-the-art exhibitry and some, interactives that are pretty cool. And I like these touch screens where you can access stories of victory, hate, and loss. Those are the big sub-themes: victory, hate, and loss. And they've got all these amazing videos. Mapping political freedom. What a great concept there. It transcends race. It talks about places in the world. I mean, freedom, this is why America matters. Let's be honest. Freedom matters. And to be truly true to our inherent values since 1776, that needs to extend in every direction amongst our citizens. Dealing with colored versus white worlds. I love this photo collage, really fascinating. Ruby Bridges, famous, Norman Rockwell picture on the lower left, famous because she desegregated the schools in New Orleans. She's still living, last I knew, and these are some of the epic dramas that are presented. The bombing of the Birmingham church in 1963. Oh, man, this was the moment, 63, 64, 65, when this was the high watermark of the civil rights movement, and maybe we are entering into phase 2 now. It would be exciting. Anyway, that is, Selma to Birmingham. Gosh, you sit at this lunch counter here and you do this thing with your hands. It conveys the sense of what it would take if you were being attacked in the most virulent way and outnumbered by angry whites, and the dignity, the restraint, the pressure, the mental anxiety, and it conveys it so brilliantly. It's really something to experience. Again, the bombing of the church, Selma to Montgomery, the marches of 1965 drew attention to injustice of voting regulations, led to the Voting Rights Act. Bloody Sunday, George Wallace refused to protect marchers. LBJ sent in 2,000 U.S. troops. These were big, big moments. After Martin Luther King's assassination in 1968, James Brown was performing in Boston, and his spoken word, his talk, his rhetoric calmed. WGBH covered the event live. It was, these are epic, heart-stirring moments. But down to Birmingham, Alabama, the art museum there is phenomenal and has outstanding, one of the best collections of African pottery in the United States, but also contemporary African-American art, and I mean, it's totally worth it. The 16th Street Baptist Church at Kelly Ingraham Park in Birmingham served as a central staging ground for large-scale demonstrations during the American Civil Rights Movement in the 60s, and there are tours. It is an active house of worship, but it is also functions as a museum. These are some stained glass windows at the site that was bombed, and where 4 girls were killed. One of these stained glass windows is dedicated to Professor Booker T. Washington by the Tuskegee Club of Birmingham. And these are, again, the girls that lost their lives in that. And this is a monument to them. Kelly Ingram Park. And by the way, the girls were Ada Mae Collins, Carol Robertson, Cynthia Wesley, and Denise McNair. They will be remembered always. Statuary. This commemorates incidents in Birmingham with Martin Luther King and water hoses and Bull Connor and Birmingham Civil Rights Heritage Trail. You can walk around these districts. It's so exciting. Birmingham does a spectacular job of public history. If you're just interested in that, it's a destination hugely worth visiting. The Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, opened in 1992. Birmingham's contributions to the civil rights movement. Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth challenged segregation laws as early as 1956. His house was bombed. Fearless leader and beaten for trying to enroll his children in an all-white school in 57. Participated in sit-ins in 60. This is a great institution, and they've got the things that I love about museums: collections of artifacts and historic photography is amazing. What we do in the business with information, journalism of the time, statistics worth remembering, timelines worth remembering. Remember the Freedom Rides from 1961, challenging segregation, aggressively provocative, and there was violence in Anniston, Birmingham, and Montgomery. The governor wouldn't talk to President Kennedy. Beatings at Greyhound Terminal in Montgomery. These are epic stories. And then the separation of equal but separate law, in which African Americans had their own schools and they were supposed to be equal, but they weren't. And this is an exhibit that dramatizes the imbalance. Pretty fascinating stuff that is really fastest and best learned in a museum environment. This is Reverend Shuttleworth, Ralph Abernathy, and Reverend King. 1963, the Birmingham jail incident, one of the great works of civil rights literature by Martin Luther King. Story about Tiananmen Square and working that. I mean, these are really interesting museums, working that into the picture. There's a Mississippi Delta Heritage Trail. National Park Service does a great job with that. Maps and statistics. The Mississippi Delta, maybe it was the only part of the United States. 150 years ago, population was like 80% African descent. This is where the birth of the blues took place, hardly a surprise. And the Delta Blues Museum, Clarksdale, Mississippi, is also part of this itinerary I'm suggesting. Mississippi Delta Cultural Center across the river in Helena, Arkansas. The thing that stirred us the most really was Memphis and the Lorraine Hotel. The National Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Hotel, which in 2014 opened to the public after a $27 million renovation. It is gripping with a capital G. The thing is, I've been to quite a few of these civil rights museums, and while they overlap a little bit in the stories they tell, they don't overlap at all in the way they tell them. Reflections on Black life in America. How does it feel to be a problem? Oh, man. Timelines, Jim Crow. This is a map of lynchings, riots, and desegregation, sites of history. Learned a lot in recent years about the Green Book, how African Americans, tourists, and travel had to know where blacks were welcome. So there was a whole literature on this subject. Medgar Evers, 1963, when he attempted to desegregate the University of Mississippi, was assassinated. The March on Washington, where Martin Luther King gave the famous Dream speech in 1963. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, LBJ. Voting Rights Act of 1965. Martin Luther King's last stand was the sanitation workers' strike in Memphis in 1968. It was the night before his assassination that he gave the "I've seen the mountaintop" speech, and I'm ready to die, one of the most hair-raising, goosebumps-inducing, emotional dramas in the life of our history. And my God, when you go to this museum, visit the room across from the hotel where James Earl Ray assassinated King. You can stand and literally look at the kind of gun that he used. It's hair-raising. Again, Nashville does signage. The Mississippi Delta does signage, and the technology of signage. I have another video on that. It's really great. We went to Fisk University in Nashville, and this is where W.E.B. Du Bois taught. It was founded in 1866, one of the great historically black colleges in the United States, and the home of the Jubilee Singers and Jubilee Hall. And then this incredible Carl Van Vechten Art Gallery with a lot of works donated by Georgia O'Keeffe and Alfred Stieglitz. This is one of the most interesting art experiences I've ever had. And I won't go into all the details, but pictures by African-American artist Aaron Douglas from 1944 and David Driscoll, 1968. Really amazing stuff. We went to the Colonial Dames Travelers Rest Plantation in Nashville, which has a weaving house dedicated to black history, details of who actually lived and worked there. They've done an incredible amount of wonderful scholarship, and again, incorporating the Colonial Dames. It's wonderful. Then we're still not out of Nashville. We went to Belmead Plantation, which has slave housing and personalized history. In neighboring Franklin, Tennessee, we went to the Carter Plantation with slave quarters and interpretation. Other places, Harper's Ferry, mothership of the National Park Service Research and production area, very important place. Probably the most interesting historic national park in the country. I'm not sure what year it was founded, but you could literally spend an entire day just in Little Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. Hampton Plantation in Towson, Maryland has amazing slave quarters. In Dover, Delaware, the John Dixon Plantation does an outstanding job. George Washington's Mount Vernon has more and more, just outside of D.C., has more and more African-American history. We made it to the Brown versus Board of Education National Historic Site in Kansas, Topeka, Kansas, and that was I think it was 54. It was really the beginning of the second wave of the civil rights movement. Very wonderful, important stuff. The Reginald Lewis Museum of Maryland, African American History and Culture, founded in 2005 in Baltimore. A private black philanthropist, private philanthropy, doing this incredible job of personalizing and even localizing black history. It's definitely worth a tour to Baltimore. These are a couple details from exhibits that were there when we were there. Then there is in Detroit, the Charles Wright Museum of African American History, founded in 1965, in the back of his car. It's incredible what they've done there. And this is a giant place with the best dioramas I've seen depicting the slave trade. And it's, you really need a trigger warning before you walk in there. Some of the stuff is hard to look at, but this is what the museum field has been doing for the past 20 years. It's very impressive. I love these biographies of epic personalities. I happen personally to live in the town where Paul Robeson had a house and lived. His family lived mostly for about 15, 20 years. His son went to Enfield, Connecticut High School. Cool stuff. Changing America, an exhibit we saw at the Charles Wright Museum, talking about 1963 and 1863, two of the epic years in the national narrative of slavery and black history. I love music, so who cannot fail to admit that the black contribution to American music is preeminent. It is who we are. And Rosa Parks Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. Don't miss that. And then Old Alabama Town, kind of a mini Sturbridge Village right in the city of Montgomery, capital of Alabama. And some really interesting architectural house forms, a lot of African-American history. One of the coolest things I've ever done was go to the Motown Museum in Detroit. An experience I'll never forget, because our tour guide, basically, it's our choral coach, she got the tour group singing their way through the tour. It was an amazing, unforgettable experience. Of course, the big story is the National Museum of African American History and Culture on the Mall in D.C., which opened, I'm forgetting now, was it 2016 or 15? But we didn't break for lunch, didn't break for bathrooms. We were there the minute they were open, and we were the last people out, and you couldn't, in whatever it was, 8 hours, you couldn't experience all of it. And we'd move right along. It's an amazing, almost a 2-day thing, just that one museum. And, we went there the first year that they opened, and I don't know, there was something about seeing an almost equal balance of white and black, visitors. It was, it was a very busy day. And to see 3 generations of black families, children, young adults, and their parents, sometimes even grandparents, doing this experience together, it was pretty amazing. And there's so many facets of our history that we don't know enough about that they tell here. About the sugar industry, the rice industry, the plantation system, how it worked, places of significance like Angola Prison, and then the role African Americans have played, the military in World War I, some of the personalities again, like Ida B. Wells, journalist, freedom fighter, incredible, and then Michael Jordan. I mean, there's so many of these epic personalities. Some of our superpowers are black powers. Some of the athletic heroes, the Williams sisters, and of course, basketball. Kobe Bryant. Then they tell the story of redlining and urban renewal. This is the great book on urban renewal. I don't know if it can be written, but it's not been written. Urban renewal did more damage to American cities than World War II did to Europe. And so many of our problems go back to this federal government policy of throwing money at cities to demolish slums. And there are many sides to this story. We're not talking about it. Finally, the National Museum of African American History and Culture in D.C. has an amazing section on Black art. It may not be the largest or very best collection presentation of African American art in the country. Brooklyn Museum does a great job, but it is amazing. Well, let's go to Boston. The Northeast Museum of African American History on Beacon Hill, in an amazing building, also tells an amazing story. It's not as big, but they also do tours. That whole part of Beacon Hill has a rich, vibrant Black history that is beautifully told. The Isaac Royal House and Slave Quarters in Medford, Mass. Incredible. The David Ruggles Center and the Story of Sojourner Truth in Northampton, Mass. Places like the Webdean Stevens Museum in Wethersfield, Connecticut. Bush Holly House in Greenwich, Connecticut. A lot of our house museums that never talked about the story of slavery under their own roof are now doing so. Also here in Connecticut, there is this Freedom Trail, all these sites that are marked, administered by our State Historic Preservation Office. Pretty cool, work in progress. In Hartford, Connecticut, where we have this Johnny Rogers Center that is not yet open to the public. I hope to live long enough to see it do what we need in this city. And a lot of places have untapped potential. Let's just say Hartford is one of them. I've done some work with Graveyard, north end of Hartford, which is a predominantly Black neighborhood. I'd like to do more. Black history, it's the story of us. I mean, it's not a part of it. It is central to it. And Black lives matter, but Black history matters. So let's get on with the show, and thank you for listening. Share if you like this. I also do live. I'm always finding new material, do live stand-up presentation. Call me. Contact me, and let's get together. Have a great day. Bye.